Oncology Institute, and we'll be talking about nutrition.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have any of you ever driven down the street and found one of these little rascals sit themselves right down in the middle of the road? And then they can't figure out which direction to go. They start to go to the left, you veer to the right. As soon as you do, they veer to the right, you veer to the left. And they probably go about 1 mile to 2 miles an hour. I had one who kept me going for almost 1/4 of a mile before he finally decided to exit the main thoroughfare. The reason I'm using the squirrel is because it represents what medicine has done to you as far as nutrition over the last 50 years. We have taken you in one direction, and then we have taken you in the other. And we have represented total confusion. Hopefully today I can clarify things for you a little bit. During this photo shoot, the squirrel, somewhat reluctantly, is chewing on a pretzel. The reason why I use the pretzel is because it represents sugar. It's a carbohydrate, and that's bad. And I'm going to show you the reasons why. This slide represents a comparison to our ancestors' diet and the present diet. As you can see, in the ancestors' diet, about 75% of the calories we consumed were in the form of fats, and only 5% was consumed with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are rare. If you go to the Eskimos in northern Canada, the Inuit Eskimos, eat a diet which is almost entirely fat and protein. There's almost no carbs. They have almost no incidence of heart disease and almost no incidence of cancer. But in the United States in the 1960s, the diet was modified. Now, a recommendation for 60% carbohydrates and only 20% fats is used. When I was watching TV last night with some of my grandchildren, I watched these reruns from Star Trek, and I was looking at the waistlines. Because you see, when you look at those waistlines, these are the waistlines of the Starship Enterprise. To seek out new calories, to go where no one has ever gone before. Holy warp drive. What on earth happened when this starship captain switched professions to that of an attorney, who now becomes Denny Crane in Boston? Actually, Denny is representing what the guidelines of the US government have taught the world to do over the last 50 years. Because if we go back to when Star Trek was being watched, we recommended a change in diet, which then caused the rate of obesity to go from 13% to a present value of over 35%. And the only thing that changed was the recommendations in the diet. This concept was introduced by a gent by the name of Ancel Keys. He was not a physician, he was a biologist at Harvard, who introduced something called the lipid hypothesis. That is, that saturated fats run up cholesterol levels, and elevated cholesterol leads to heart disease. It's nice and simple, but it's not true. Keys was self-appointed to the advisory committee of the American Heart Association. Despite the obvious flaws, his theory was officially incorporated into the American Heart Association guidelines in 1961, and you can see what happened after that. Now, with political influence, there became a policy that no more than 30% of the calories you consume should be fat, no more than 10% of those calories from saturated fat. And these recommendations were subsequently adopted by the US Department of Agriculture. In 1992, the US government endorsed the high-carb, low-fat diet. the American Diabetes Association and the American Heart Association similarly agreed in 1994 that 60 to 70% of our calories should be consumed as carbohydrates. Notice the sharp rise in diabetes that occurred after that time. The prevalence of type 2 diabetes has tripled in the past 40 years. Between 1995 and 2010, the number of diagnosed cases of diabetes jumped by 50% or more in 42 of our states, and by 100% or more in 18 of our states. Now, in China, a country that historically had low rates of diabetes, 16% of their population is diabetic. That's over 160 million people. And this is the most important slide that I can show you, because it has all the facts right here. What this basically says is that when you store fat in your body, if you eat a high-carb diet, you cannot mobilize the fat. It will sit there like a log. Only with the low-carb diet can you actually mobilize fat to be used. And by a low-carb diet, I mean low carb. Somewhere between 50 and 75 grams of carbohydrates a day, no more. Because you see, if you go more, how steep the curve comes down, you can't break the fat down. It sits there. You carry it around. You can't possibly use it. And the difficulty becomes for runners is that when a marathon runner runs a 26-mile race, they bonk out at about 18 miles. You cannot store more than 2,000 calories of sugar in your body to use. Once you expend those 2,000 calories, you got nothing left. You may be carrying 60 to 70,000 calories of fat, but you cannot mobilize it unless you become what we call ketogenic. Runners are better at it. They may get 2,500 calories out of sugar because they can store it in their muscle. But beyond that point, they bonk out. If someone is on a high-fat, low-carb diet, they can run 100 miles without stopping because they can mobilize the fat, and the tremendous fat reserves allow them to do that. So the theory that fat makes you fat is totally wrong. Carbohydrates make you fat. Fat produces energy. So if there is one slide that I want you to remember, this is the most important one. In essence, what we are is, we're a truck going down the road with this tremendous fuel tank, and we can't mobilize one bit of fuel in that tank. We have to use the much smaller container in the tractor component of this truck. These are two books that will give you the background that I don't have the time this morning to discuss, but they're excellent texts. They're written so that you can actually understand what's going on, and they give you the references that you need to use so you can appreciate the fact that I'm not pulling your leg. I'll tell you when I'm pulling your leg. For you to get a good reference, and there's over 70 hours of information, go on YouTube, go to that site, Low Carb Down Under. It's a series of lectures that are given every year in Australia, and they're given by professionals who know a lot more about this subject than I do. Plus, you get to enjoy the Australian accent, which I cannot duplicate. What does sugar do as far as cancer is concerned? Sugar, carbohydrates, drive cancer. And they drive it in three ways, and we'll cover those three ways. The first one is this. When sugar enters the cell and it crosses the cell membrane, it does so in the form of glucose. Once glucose is taken into the cell, it quickly breaks down to pyruvate, which then becomes lactic acid. And if people exercise and they get sore muscles immediately afterwards, cramps, it's because of the buildup of lactic acid that encircles the area of the cell. So if we were to stick a probe into someone's body after exercise, you would find that the amount of lactic acid goes up. The cell can then take that back in and mobilize it. But this process so far is called glycolysis. For the cell to break the sugar down farther, it has to have an organism within the cell called the mitochondria. The mitochondria then takes the pyruvate in, and with the presence of oxygen, it can break the remaining glucose down and extract a tremendous amount of sugar out of the glucose. When you exercise a lot, you may not have enough oxygen in the cell at that particular moment, and so that's why pyruvate and lactate is formed. And this represents the normal cell. And those little critters that you're seeing in there labeled mitochondria, you have about 1,000 to 2,000 of them in every cell. And they are responsible for taking food products and turning it into energy. This is another diagram of a mitochondria cut in half, and you can see all of the folds in there, and that allows a lot of surface area so the glucose can work its way through the process to produce energy. On the left is the normal mitochondria. Again, you can see all of the folds that occur within there that increase the surface area so this biochemical reaction can occur. But look at the one on the right. The one on the right doesn't have any folds anymore. That's a mitochondria in a cancer cell. In particular, this cancer is called a glioblastoma multiforme. It occurs in the brain, and it's one of the most aggressive cancers that we know of. But that mitochondria is defective, and you can't use it. It won't produce enough energy to make the cells stay alive. But cancer cells definitely stay alive. So how do they do it? They do it by consuming a tremendous amount of sugar. And that's why you're seeing all of that lactate being produced. This is called the Warburg effect, and it was described in the early 1920s. Dr. Warburg found that even in the presence of oxygen, a cancer cell will not use oxygen to make energy. It only wants sugar, carbohydrates. It doesn't know how to burn fat. It can't use fat. If you eat fat and you eliminate carbs, you will starve cancer cells. And that's the proof. So basically, you would like to use the mitochondria, but as you just saw in that example, you can't. It's not functional. The first step in the fact that sugar and carbohydrates help cancer cells is what I just showed you. Now let me give you an analogy as to how this takes place. Let's suppose we go to a restaurant, we sit down and we order 20 peanut butter sandwiches. They bring you 20 sandwiches, and this is the guy sitting next to us. He starts to eat, but he only takes one bite out of each of the 20 peanut butter sandwiches. He pays his bill and he leaves. Well, we think that's kind of strange, so when the server comes over, we ask the server if this guy has ever done this before. Yes, he does it every day. He comes in, he orders 20 sandwiches, takes one bite, pays his bill, and leaves. And if we don't have enough peanut butter, and the kids in the restaurant have peanut butter sandwiches, he will steal their sandwiches, take one bite, and leave. That is exactly what a cancer cell does. It cannot break the sandwich down. It can only handle one bite out of each sandwich. So cancer cells don't burn more sugar for energy. They burn more sugar because they can't use it efficiently. And the consumption of sugar is one thing that we measure when we do a special study called a PET-CT scan. When you get a PET-CT scan, we are measuring the use of sugar in your body. Okay? We know that if cells use a lot of sugar, and we scan the body later with a radioactively labeled sugar, it will leave footprints. And those footprints will for a doctor like myself, show me where the cancer is so I can design the treatment appropriately. The picture on the left is a gent that I treated for a head and neck cancer in mid-2012. So now we're 4 years out, we've cured him. By the time 3 years have gone by, if it doesn't come back, he's cured. So This is just one of our bazillion cures that we've had over the years. But the bottom line is, when you look at the slide on the left, you see those big, bright light bulbs going off, and those light bulbs represent the presence of the cancer. In this particular case, the one in the middle is in the base of the tongue. Everything is reversed, left becomes right, right becomes left. So on the film's right side, which is the patient's left side, that big area is the tonsil, and the one behind that, that's farther down, represents the lymph nodes that are involved. And in this particular case, the lymph node on the opposite side of the neck was also involved. So he had what we call stage 4 disease. And as you can see from looking at that picture, on the right-hand side, he's cured. But it represents the use of sugar, and that's the point that we're making this morning. The next step in this process that can cause cancer cells to grow is something called the pentose phosphate pathway. This takes sugar in the form of glucose, and it allows the cell to produce DNA and to make fat. And those components are very important. Yeah, water would be great. Do we have any? That allows the cell to make new cells to multiply and grow. So that's the second way that cancer cells are fed by sugar. And the third way is this signal receptor that we have. Thanks very much. Over here on the right-hand side. Thank you. Whoa, that's great. So these signal receptors are receptors for insulin. Your pancreas makes a tremendous amount of insulin when you take in sugar. You have about 1 tablespoon of sugar in your entire bloodstream. That's all it's allowed. If you have more than that, you've got to get it out of the bloodstream or it will kill you. If you eat a can or you drink a can of Coke, it has between 7 and 10 times that much sugar in 1 can. That means you got to get the stuff out of the bloodstream or you will die. And so your pancreas revs up the production of insulin. Insulin will drive the sugar out of the bloodstream into the cells, in particular into fat cells. But with the surge that we have when we take carbohydrates in, which are very complex sugars, and they can break down very, very quickly, you get this tremendous surge in your bloodstream of sugar that overfires the pancreas. And once it does, it creates an excess of insulin. And insulin is a hormone. It will then lock on to that receptor on the cell. And once it locks onto that receptor, all kinds of havoc occurs. It then sends messages to so many different parts of the cell to become chaotic and abnormal. And that's exactly what cancer cells are. And so it may not just be the consumption of sugar that's the problem. It's these pulses that we go through when we shock our body with carbohydrates, because we were never designed to handle that. That's something that's manufactured in our food sources nowadays so that they can make more money selling you the junk. So as you can see from this example, the first factor that sugar causes cancer cells to go nuts for is glycolysis. The second one is the pentose phosphate pathway, and the third one is the overproduction of insulin. Those are the 3 reasons. Now, the reason I'm putting those headings up there is because I stole these slides off the internet, so I'm trying to acknowledge the fact that I'm a thief and that I won't get in trouble, okay? Now we'll talk about the blood work that is the basis for many physicians recommending medications. For every complicated problem, there's a solution that's simple, direct, understandable, and wrong. And the way we've been interpreting the information in our blood test is totally and completely wrong. This is a lipoprotein. This is the way cholesterol gets carried around in your body, and it comes in several different sizes, but I use this picture, again, I stole it. I use this picture to represent a lipoprotein. It's a combination of fat and protein in a sac, and within that is triglycerides and cholesterol esters. And this is the way your body carries its fuel supply around to other organs. There's nothing abnormal about this. This is healthy. This is the way our bodies are put together. And these lipoproteins come in different sizes. The biggest is a chylomicron. It's humongous. Think of one of these balloons being as big as the room. Only 1% of the chylomicron is the protein, the rest of it is lipid content. So when you eat a fatty meal and your intestine absorbs the fat, it then goes into these sacs called chylomicrons, and it gets transported around the body and gives up some of the fat to cells as it goes, and then it finally winds up going to the liver. So this diagram on the top portion shows you that move as it goes around to the liver. The liver is very effective in now repackaging the fat so it can be distributed to the rest of the body. Now I want you to think of these as trucks, Federal Express trucks. And they pick up their cargo from the main branch, and then they start going around the body and distributing their packages. VLDL, very large density, intermediate density for IDL, and then LDL, which is low density. Again, there is nothing wrong with these cholesterols. They're not hurting you. This is the way your body is designed. And so if we draw your blood, we ought to be seeing these things in the blood, because otherwise, how are you going to get any nutritional support, right? The fact that when you draw the blood, you have a lot of these trucks in your blood is the same as if we go out to the interstate and we watch trucks going down the interstate. There's nothing wrong with some of those trucks being full or almost empty. That's just the way our economy functions, and this is the way your body functions. So when the lipoproteins are produced from the liver, they go out into VLDL, and then IDL, and then LDL, and again, this is the normal process. VLDL contains a significant amount of triglycerides. High triglyceride levels you don't like, and I'll show you in your blood tests how we look at that. That is the normal process. That is healthy. This becomes unhealthy. When LDL is damaged, it changes its size. And when it does, the liver will no longer take the LDL back to recycle it. So you're driving the Federal Express truck and you have an accident. And that truck is not designed to go back to the warehouse to get repaired. Because when you damage the LDL, there is no repair. The liver recognizes that as an inappropriate truck, and it will not allow it to re-enter. It has to go somewhere else, the dump. And in this case, if we're looking at the Marion County dump, we are probably looking at the highest elevation point in the entire county, right? And the reason why is this. Think of your garbage as small, dense lipoproteins. They no longer work anymore, and the liver won't take them back. They have to find a dumping ground, and that dumping ground becomes your blood vessels, in this case, the city dump. Now, what do you do when you put trash in the city dump? You put dirt over it, don't you? The same way that in the bloodstream, the human body puts dirt over these low-density lipoproteins. It builds up layers within your blood vessels that, as a result, narrow the passageway through which the blood can go. Until finally, if the elevation of the dump is too high in the blood vessel, that results in obstruction. The other analogy that I can use is this. I'm full of analogy. I'm full of a lot of stuff, but I'm full of analogy. Let's take an ice cube and we'll put it in water. If you sit there and watch, the ice cube will gradually, methodically, symmetrically dissolve away. And that's the way the Federal Express truck delivers its products. And then it goes back to get reloaded. That would be the same as rebuilding the ice cube again. Now, when you're using carbohydrates, your liver is now producing an excess of VLDL. Your body doesn't need that much fat. It can't use it. It doesn't know how to handle it. That would be the same as loading too many Federal Express trucks up with too many packages. They just literally can't handle it. And for the ice cube, the analogy would be the same as taking the ice cube and throwing it against the wall. When you do, it shatters. It has lost its shape. It can no longer be accepted back into the liver for reaccumulation and then redistribution. You got to get rid of it, and you get rid of it in your blood vessels. That's called small, dense LDL. When you do a blood test, you are not measuring small, dense LDL. Why? Because it's not floating around. It already got buried in your city dump of your blood vessels. So when you're measuring that level of LDL, it's ridiculous to put a value on that. There's the deposit of the junk in your blood vessels. What I'm basically saying is there are two types of LDL. There's the kind that regenerates itself and goes back, and that's the kind that you're basically measuring, and that's healthy. And then there's the other type that gets deposited in your blood vessels, and that'll kill you. And you don't measure that with a blood test. This graph shows you the comparison of triglycerides to VLDL. You can't measure VLDL in your bloodstream. That is a calculation that we do mathematically to determine how much VLDL you have, and it's not measured. But what you can do is you can measure triglycerides. And so you know that if your triglycerides are high, your VLDL is high, which means you're making more of those small, dense LDLs that will kill you. So don't look at small, dense LDL. That test costs a couple of $1,000s to do. And you're not going to spend that kind of money to get that information. You will get the same information by looking at your triglycerides. Your triglycerides are a mirror image of the bad LDL. The exact opposite takes place with HDL. HDL is a very positive component of cholesterol, and its value will be low when your triglycerides are high. What you want in the ideal state is low triglycerides and high HDL. This is the lining of a cell. Those little black spots represent LDL. And as you can see, when it moves from the left to the right, those little black spots become incorporated into the cell itself. That's exactly what happens in the walls of your blood vessels, and it builds up over time. Now, these are a few case studies of patients in Australia and their blood values. They went on to a high-fat, low-carb diet, and you can see that the cholesterol level actually went up. That would make a physician very concerned if the total cholesterol was meaningful, but it's not. What's very important is that the triglyceride level went from 1.6 to 0.7. It was cut in half. That means that those bad, small, dense LDLs went to a dramatic reduction. And yet, when we look at the HDLs, which are the good cholesterols, the number went up, 35% higher than before. For your LDL, which again, we're measuring a false value in your bloodstream, it didn't really change much at all. But when that special $2,000 study is done, it shows on the bottom that your bad, small density LDL went from 11% to only 1%. This person does not need to be put on any statins. The doctor needs to leave them alone. Here's another patient. From 2007 to 2011, the patient was on a high-fat, low-carb diet. The cholesterol level went up. That again would shock the physician and say, we've got to start statins. Absolutely not. Statins are not indicated. And the reason they aren't is because when you look at the triglyceride level, it too was almost cut in half. It went from 2.1 to 1.2. The HDLs, the good ones, went from 0.6 to 1.5. They over doubled. And when you look at the percent of the bad LDL, it went from 17% to 0. This patient does not need medication. Another example, a patient placed on the high-fat, low-carb diet had a cholesterol of 5.1. It went down to 4.4 on the high-fat, low-carb. That's great, but it's meaningless. Triglycerides were cut in more than half, went from 2.6 to 1.1. The HDL went from 1.1 to 1.4, which again is great. But look what happened to the LDL, and that's where this physician made the decision to put this patient on statins. The LDL went from 2.3 to 3.1, and that was the basis for starting the statins, and it was totally wrong. Because the small, dense lipoproteins, the bad ones, went from 24% to 2%. This patient didn't need medication. The only thing it did was make more money for the drug company. But you see, we're interpreting the information incorrectly. We're using the LDL to determine whether a patient should get statins or not. Why on earth would we focus on LDLs? Because it's the only thing the pharmaceutical industry has figured out how to measure and how to change. The drugs will lower the LDL. There is no drug that will change HDLs. And so the only thing they can market is lowering your LDL. The problem is, what you're measuring is worthless. You're measuring the good LDL, the trucks that go back to the Federal Express factory. This is the way it's supposed to work. VLDL becomes IDL, which becomes LDL, which then goes back to the liver, and that's the way the Federal Express trucks work. This is what happens with your high-carb, low-fat diet. The VLDL goes straight to the small, dense LDL, and it gets deposited in your blood vessels, and you die. On a high-fat diet, it goes VLDL to IDL to LDL back to the liver, and that's the way God expected your body to function. Because I don't think God ever expected us to consume as much carbohydrates as we do. Now, here's the disclaimer. Do not think that by increasing your fat in your diet and continuing to eat the same amount of carbohydrates will give you these results. If you increase your fat but maintain your carbohydrates, you will die of cardiovascular disease. And moderation does not work here. If you go back to the original graph that I showed you of your ancestors' diet compared to our present diet, now if you want to go back to the original ancestor diet, moderation does work. But we're no longer in an environment where there's moderation. We are so far out to lunch as far as the way we're eating that any moderation is a disaster. So the bottom line is, and the studies have shown this, that patients were placed on a 12-month low-carb, low-fat diet, and with the lower carbs, they lost weight, the triglycerides, which are the bad elements, fell, and the HDL, which are the good elements, rose. In this study, where the patients were placed on a very low carbohydrate diet, high fat, it was even more dramatic. The triglycerides fell, the HDL rose, and the hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of inflammation in your body, dramatically decreased as well. So the summary is, on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, you will decrease the bad small density LDLs, that is, you will avoid the city dump. You will decrease the production of triglycerides, which will kill you. You will increase the HDL cholesterol, which will save you. And you will decrease the inflammation in your entire body. And I want to thank the squirrel for making this possible today. Questions that any of you have? Yes? Then you should have listened to her. Yes. Yes, that's a good question. The Atkins diet, is that a reasonable diet? And yes, it is. But number one, it's not low enough on carbohydrates, and number two, it's too high on protein. You do not need as much protein as we consume, because excess protein